The day I buried my father, Victoria Marshall, self-declared queen of our neighborhood and self-appointed head of the HOA, left a foreclosure notice taped to my front door. That was the moment I realized, whatever I thought this inheritance was going to be, it wasn't going to be simple. The paper was thick, the print bold, but the message was clear enough. Your house is now HOA property, it read. My hands shook as I held it, but not from grief. Not this time. No, this time it was rage. My father hadn't even been in the ground for 6 hours, and already she was circling like a vulture. I stood there for a long time on that porch, staring at the notice. Then I made a promise. Victoria wasn't going to get away with this, not without a fight. And if she wanted to test me, she was about to learn that revenge isn't just sweet. It's a dish best served with justice. I remembered the last thing my father said to me, as if he was standing right there. He was in his old armchair, the one my mother had reupholstered so many times it barely resembled the original. His hands, rough and worn from years working as a carpenter, gripped the armrest as he leaned forward. "Alex," he said, his voice tired but steady, "this house isn't just wood and nails. It's our legacy. Victoria's been trying to swallow this place up for years. Don't let her win." Back then, I didn't understand why he sounded so urgent. But standing there on our front porch, holding that foreclosure notice with Victoria's name signed in elegant, practiced loops, it all clicked into place. My father had seen this coming. The neighborhood I grew up in was gone. 10 years ago, before I left for college, it was a tight-knit community. We borrowed sugar from each other. We watched each other's kids. But now it was Victoria's kingdom. 3 years earlier, she'd created the HOA from nothing. She drafted the rules, enforced them like a tyrant, and turned what used to be friendly neighbors into foot soldiers for her empire. My father had been her last real obstacle. Our home, a deep blue Craftsman with hand-carved porch posts my dad made himself, sat like an eyesore in her sea of beige conformity. Inside the house it was quiet. Too quiet. My footsteps echoed on the hardwood floors Dad installed when I was 12. Every room held a memory. The scuff marks from where I played hockey in the living room, the kitchen doorway with faded pencil lines marking every inch I grew, the window seat where Mom used to sit and read to me. These weren't things Victoria could take, not without tearing the house down. And I wasn't about to let her. A knock on the door snapped me out of it. I looked through the stained glass panels my dad had restored last summer. And there she was, Victoria Marshall, every silver hair in place, immaculate pantsuit, a folder under her arm like she was about to close a business deal. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Alex, darling," she said in a voice so sweet it made my stomach turn. "I'm so sorry about James. He was always resistant to progress, but I'm sure you'll be more reasonable." I cracked the door but kept the chain latched. "I'm not interested in your HOA, I told her. "This house isn't your property, and it never will be." Her smile didn't waver, but her eyes sharpened like broken glass. "Oh, but it already is," she said, tilting her head just slightly. "You see, when a property is surrounded by HOA members, it becomes incorporated by default. Adverse possession, Alex. Your father's passing just sped things along." She was lying. I wasn't a lawyer, but I knew enough. Dad made sure I understood the rights to this house long before he got sick. "That's not how adverse possession works," I said. "You might want to leave the legal stuff to someone who actually knows the law." Victoria sighed like I was being difficult. "Speaking of attorneys," she said, pulling a document from her folder, "we've already filed the paperwork. You've got 30 days to pay 5 years' worth of back dues and comply with HOA rules. Otherwise, we'll have to take action." I slammed the door in her face and locked it. Through the glass, I watched her carefully place the document on our old welcome mat, one Mom had made back when she took a pottery class. Then Victoria turned on her heel and walked away like she hadn't just declared war. I grabbed my phone and made the call Dad would have expected me to make. Sarah Chen, the best real estate attorney in the state. If Victoria wanted a fight, she just picked one with the wrong person. Sarah's office smelled like old books and fresh coffee. She flipped through the stack of papers I'd brought, Dad's deed, Victoria's fake foreclosure notice, and some unsettling photos I found in the mailbox. Pictures of me, watering Dad's roses, getting the mail, sitting in his garage. Victoria was building a harassment case, painting me as a threat, trying to make it look like I was the aggressor. Classic HOA power move, Sarah said, pointing at one photo where I was arguing with Victoria through my car window. But she's gone further than most. A knock at the door interrupted us. In walked Martha Wheeler, cane tapping against the hardwood floor. Martha had lived across the street for 40 years, and she was holding a battered envelope like it was gold. "I hoped I'd find you here," she said, giving me a knowing look. "Your dad wasn't her first target, and he won't be the last unless we stop her." Martha was one of the few who hadn't bowed to Victoria. While everyone else painted their houses regulation beige and ripped out their gardens, Martha kept her purple front door and her collection of garden gnomes. She pulled out documents from the envelope as she spoke. 3 years ago, she said, Victoria did the same thing to the Rodriguez family, claimed their house was automatically part of the HOA. They couldn't afford to fight, so they sold, for half what it was worth, to Victoria's daughter's real estate company. Sarah's brow furrowed as she examined the documents. "These signatures," she murmured, comparing them to Victoria's latest paperwork. "They're identical. She's been using the same templates for years." My phone buzzed. Another email from Victoria. This time, she'd copied the whole HOA board. Attached were photos of Dad's workshop, claiming it violated building codes. He'd built that workshop 20 years ago, long before Victoria's HOA existed. She was trying to create a paper trail, manufacturing violations, but Sarah had news. "She made a mistake," Sarah said. "I pulled county records. That HOA, it was never legally registered. She's been operating without authority for 3 years." There was noise in the hallway, and then Barbara Jenkins rushed in. Victoria's second in command. Her usual perfect makeup was smudged, and her hands trembled as she clutched her handbag. "I can't do this anymore," Barbara said. "Victoria's gone too far. Last night, she asked me to notarize backdated documents. Said your father agreed to join the HOA before he died. When I refused, she threatened to expose my mortgage to the board." "Would you put that in writing?" Sarah asked, dead serious. Before Barbara could answer, my phone buzzed again. A text from Tom, another neighbor. "Victoria's at your house." With a locksmith I stood, ready to run out the door, but Sarah caught my arm. "Let her dig herself deeper," she said. "We'll call the police. Then we give Victoria what she wants, an audience." Martha smiled, her eyes gleaming. "Time to show her what real neighbors look like." We arrived at the house 15 minutes later. Victoria stood there, arms folded, watching the locksmith work on my front door. A crowd had gathered behind her, all wearing their matching HOA uniforms, beige and navy like some kind of suburban cult. "Stop right there," I yelled, Sarah and Martha on either side of me. "Let's see those court orders, Victoria." For just a second, her composure slipped, but then she was back to her icy smile. "Alex, you're making a scene," she said. "This is a simple property transition." "The HOA," Sarah interrupted, holding up paperwork. "That was never legally registered. You've been operating without any legal standing, Mrs. Marshall." The locksmith paused, tools in hand. He glanced between us. Victoria's face flushed red, but she didn't back down. She pulled out her phone instead. "You want to play hardball?" she said. "Fine. Check your email, Alex. There are photos of your father's last days. Do you really want the board to know what happened the night he died?" For a second, I couldn't breathe. She was using my father's death as a weapon, twisting it, poisoning it. "He called an emergency HOA meeting that night," Victoria said, her voice rising. "Said he had something to confess. Hours later, he was dead. Convenient, isn't it?" The memory hit me hard. Dad's last voicemail, the one I never answered. "Alex," his voice had said, "I found something. About Victoria. About the Rodriguez house. Call me back. It's important." Martha stepped forward, cane thudding against the concrete. "That's not how it happened, Victoria," she said, her voice cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. "James came to expose you." Barbara emerged from the crowd then, holding a leather folder. "I have the original documents," she said. "Victoria didn't create the HOA to protect property values. She used it to push families out and buy their homes through shell companies." The crowd murmured. Victoria's supporters shifted uneasily. Cracks were forming. It's all lies, Victoria snapped, but her voice was cracking now. Really? Sarah asked, her voice cool. The Patels? The Clarks? Families forced to sell after joining your HOA? All their homes bought by your companies? I played Dad's last voicemail on speaker. His voice filled the silence. I found something. About Victoria. He died 3 hours after leaving that message, I said. Not from illness, from a stroke. Brought on by stress. What did you say to him that night, Victoria? Her expression cracked. He was going to ruin everything, she hissed. And in that moment, the truth was out. 30 years she'd spent controlling this neighborhood, and it was over. Sarah lifted a court order. All your assets are frozen, Victoria, pending investigation. The police cars arrived right on cue. You can't do this, Victoria whispered as they cuffed her hands. Actually, I said, holding up one last folder from Dad's workshop, we can. And he made sure of it. 3 months after they took Victoria away, I found myself standing in Dad's workshop again. Morning light streamed through the windows, cutting through the dust like golden threads. It lit up the sawdust that still hung in the air. Everything was just as he'd left it. His workbench, scarred but solid, his tools lined up in careful order, and on the bench, sitting there half-finished, was the birdhouse he'd been working on before everything happened. The criminal case against Victoria Marshall had cracked wide open. What started with our neighborhood turned out to be much bigger. 5 neighborhoods, 17 families, all forced out of their homes by Victoria's carefully orchestrated schemes. The Rodriguez family's lawyer called me yesterday. They were getting their house back, at its original price, not a penny more. Victoria's so-called empire was falling apart. Her assets frozen, her reputation in shambles. But even with her gone, I couldn't shake the weight of what she said the day they arrested her. You have no idea what you started, Alex. The words stuck to me like burrs. And maybe she was right. Maybe I didn't. A knock on the workshop door broke my train of thought. Barbara Jenkins stood there, holding a heavy manila envelope in her arms like it was something precious. She'd changed since that day on the lawn. Gone was the polished look, the carefully controlled expressions. This was someone stripped bare by the truth. We found these, she said, in Victoria's home office. The police said they were done processing the evidence, so they're yours now. She handed me the envelope. I took it carefully, half expecting it to bite. Inside were photos, dozens of them. My dad at neighborhood picnics, helping someone fix a fence, teaching kids how to use a lathe in his garage. There was a photo of him laughing with Martha on her front porch. One of him and Tom hanging holiday lights in the freezing cold. Pictures that spanned years, decades even. She was watching him, I said quietly. All this time, Barbara nodded. She watched everyone, but especially your dad. He represented everything she couldn't control. I stared down at a picture of my father sitting on our porch, legs stretched out, cup of coffee in hand. There was a peacefulness in his face that made my throat tighten. There's more, Barbara said. Her voice softened, but there was something hard under it. Victoria kept records, detailed ones, about the night your father died. I didn't move, just waited. She didn't just push him over the edge with stress. That night, he confronted her. I already knew that much, but what I didn't know was why. It wasn't just about the Rodriguez family, Barbara went on. There was another house, the first one Victoria ever took. Your mother's childhood home. I blinked. What? Barbara nodded slowly. Victoria orchestrated the foreclosure. She manipulated their mortgage, back when she worked at the bank. She made it look like your mother's parents couldn't afford to stay. Your mom never knew. It hit me like a punch to the ribs. My mother had always said her parents sold the house because they were drowning in debt. But now I saw the truth. Victoria had been behind it all along. She'd started this decades before I was even born. Your father found out, Barbara said, when he was organizing his papers. He wanted to confront her, to expose her, but he was trying to protect your mother's memory too. That's why he called the meeting. He didn't want to hurt you. I sat down hard on Dad's old chair. The weight of it all was crushing, but it also made everything clearer. Dad had fought for this neighborhood until the very end, until he couldn't anymore, and now it was my turn. Outside the workshop window, I heard a car door slam. Martha was shepherding a young couple up the front walk. It took me a second to recognize them. The Rodriguezes, back for the first time since they were pushed out 3 years ago. Their little boy was staring at Dad's garden, wide-eyed. The roses Mom had planted were still blooming, stubborn as ever. Tom showed up with a stack of papers under his arm. He wasn't wearing the regulation HOA colors anymore. No navy, no beige, just a green polo and jeans. Casual, comfortable. The HOA's done, he said. Legally dissolved. No more mandatory fees. No more rules about mailbox colors or lawn heights. We're starting a real council. Voluntary. No power plays. Just neighbors. Martha nodded in approval. The way it should have been. As the sun moved higher, more people showed up. Neighbors who'd been strangers for years now smiled at each other. People lingered on front lawns. Someone fired up a grill. Kids laughed and shouted as they raced each other up and down the sidewalks. The neighborhood was coming back to life. I stood there watching it all from the porch, the same spot where Dad used to sit every evening. It felt right. Sarah stopped by with an update from the prosecutor. Victoria had accepted a plea deal. She'd serve time and make restitution to every family she hurt. That part was over, but none of us cared about the legal victory. What mattered was this. People were talking again, smiling again, trusting each other. Barbara's granddaughter raced past us. Her hair dyed bright purple, a style that would have given Victoria an aneurysm. Martha was showing Mrs. Rodriguez how to make her famous lemonade. Tom's husband was setting up his gnome collection on their front lawn, unboxed for the first time in years. The Patels were moving back in next week. Mrs. Clark was already planning a neighborhood potluck. I pulled the birdhouse from the workbench, the one Dad had started before he died. I brought it out to the porch and opened his old toolbox. The chisel felt familiar in my hand, worn smooth by years of use. I took a breath and made the first careful cut. "You were right, Dad," I said under my breath. "It was never just about the house. It was about building something real, a place people could belong to." As the afternoon stretched on, more neighbors arrived. Someone brought a guitar. Kids chased each other through front yards, ignoring property lines. Laughter bounced off houses that had been quiet for too long. When I finished the birdhouse, I hung it on Mom's favorite oak tree, right where Dad would have wanted it. A reminder. This house wasn't just property. It was home. And home isn't something anyone can take from you. Later that evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky turned orange, I found myself sitting in Dad's old chair. The porch was full of people. Martha was sharing stories about the old days. Barbara was teaching her granddaughter how to prune roses. The Rodriguez boy was playing with a wooden train set Dad had made years ago. His father was admiring the craftsmanship. It wasn't perfect. Nothing ever is. But it was real. And it was ours. Victoria had tried to control everything. She built an empire out of fear and intimidation. But Dad had shown us something better. A real community isn't about rules and regulations. It's about open doors, helping hands, people who remember what matters. I watched as neighbors, no, friends, helped each other clean up after the impromptu block party. Kids carried folding chairs back to their porches. Someone passed around extra lemonade, and for the first time in years, I felt like I was part of something bigger than myself. As night settled in, Tom handed me the final paperwork. The HOA was gone for good. In its place, we were starting over. No one would ever hold that kind of power over us again. Sarah walked up with a satisfied grin. "You did it," she said. "He'd be proud." I looked out at the street, at the lights twinkling on in every window, at the families laughing on front steps. "We did it," I said. "All of us." And that was the truth. Victoria thought she could tear us apart, but in the end, she brought us back together. And maybe that was the biggest victory of all. The wind rustled the leaves in the oak tree where the birdhouse hung. I smiled. Some legacies can't be stolen. Some bonds can't be broken. And some houses will always be more than wooden nails. They'll always be home.